Hello, I'm Karen Okigbo, and this is part of the one-to-one series of conversations between scholars at the Institute and visitors.
Hi Karen, it's really nice to have you here as a scholar in residence. And I was also really excited that you joined us 3 weeks ago for the workshop on researching race and gender. I was so excited about your talk on second-generation immigrants, Nigerian immigrants in the United States and their marital decisions, because it had so much to also say about the heterogeneity of Blackness. So I would be, because this also really very much speaks to my own research with African migrants to Germany, I would be very interested in terms of if you could elaborate a little bit on what you've learned about the heterogeneity of Blackness in the United States through your research.
Well, thank you first of all for inviting me to this talk and also for inviting me to the workshop. I really enjoyed the conversation and the discourse that we had and engaging with other scholars who also focus on Blackness in a European context, but Blackness nonetheless. In terms of my research and how it highlights heterogeneity in the Black population in the US, I'm often drawn to the history of race in the US. Race is incredibly salient, and it makes sense given the long and complex and very complicated racial history. And for quite some time now, social scientists have really investigated and used race as a unit of analysis. And as someone who is a sociologist who also focuses on migration studies, one of the things that I've found quite helpful is turning the analytical lens towards the country of origin. Mm-hmm. And that allows us to better understand just how diverse Blackness really is on a global scale. And so in the case of Nigerians, Nigeria is a completely heterogeneous country in terms of regional differences. So there's northerners, southerners, and even within the southerners, there's southeasterners and southwesterners, and those identities are quite important. In terms of ethnicity, it's also incredibly diverse. There are more than 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria, and that includes larger groups like the Igbo, Yoruba, or Hausa Fulani, but it also includes some smaller groups like Ibibio. So it's not only regionally diverse, but ethnically diverse. And in terms of ethnicity too, linguistic diversity also plays a role, with each ethnic group speaking a different language. And it's also religiously diverse. So half of the country, 50%, are Muslims, and 48%, so about the other half, are Christian, and that includes Protestant, Catholics, Presbyterians, all of the amalgamated Christian groups. And so when thinking of just how diverse that country is based on all those identities, it makes sense that when a Nigerian immigrant moves to the US, they don't just shed all those identities, they actually retain some of that. And so focusing on just how complex and diverse that group is also highlights just how other ethnic groups within the racially Black category in the US are equally diverse. And when thinking of my research, which focuses on how this group now decides who to marry, you can see just how incredibly complicated it would be, right? So you're not only picking a partner based on compatibility, but you're also interested in, factors of religion. How will we build a family together? Factors of race and ethnicity. How will we identify? What cultural traditions will we carry on? Language. So all those things really make for a very diverse group, and by extension, makes the Black population in the US quite diverse.
I was just thinking back to our conversation in the garden when we were talking about my research on hair, because I figure there's probably a lot of different rituals around marriage in Nigeria, right? And probably they differ depending on whether you're Christian or Muslim, yes. But they will also differ depending on which ethnic group you belong to. So I'm just wondering how does that tie into like, I don't know, like dressing, styling yourself for the wedding, but also just the rituals around the wedding? Like, do you see any differences in terms of what people do?
Yeah, so you more than anyone know just how complicated and intricate hair is. And even long before someone gets married, hair is such a significant role in how you present yourself in the workplace, in the school setting, in public. And in a way, hair has become very political. So whether you wear your hair in locks versus with a perm says and signals so much about what you may be trying to signal, and some also unintended messages may be sent across as well. And when it comes to marriage too, it plays such an integral role, because the way that one presents themselves during the courtship process, especially for Black women who have very versatile hair trends. So the type of person that you might meet when you're wearing one hairstyle may be quite different than when you're wearing another. And this was something that came up in my research, is for women in particular, they would talk about dating someone of a different race and having to have conversations about hair with them, saying, if my hair looks one way today, it may look another way tomorrow, and it still is me, and I'm the same person. And by extension, by the time you're getting married, that's also another important decision that people say and decide, because you're taking all these pictures on this big day, and how do you want to represent yourself on such a significant moment in your life? Yeah, so there are lots of parallels between our lines of research and even just the intricacy and complexity of hair.
And it's probably not just about how you want to present yourself, right? But I guess your parents will have a stake in that, your aunties and uncles might have a stake in that, and have an idea of like what you should look like, because you're not just representing yourself, but you're representing the family. I mean, that's at least what I've learned in my research, that oftentimes, like, it's not just your own, I mean, it is your personal decision what you do with your hair, but other people around you, from your friends to your family members, will also have an opinion and will chip in and be like, I think you should do this with your hair because people at church are now talking about us. I think especially with the natural hair, you have that where people are like, oh, they think we can no longer afford maybe to send you to a hair salon and, I don't know, get a weave fitted or something. So.
Yeah, that's certainly something that, and I briefly mentioned that hair can be so political, and in a lot of ways, I've noticed that the first generation participants and their second generation children, those who are born in the US and more acclimated to life as an American, there's some divergences in how they view hair. So for instance, most first generation Nigerians grew up with a post-colonial mindset around hair, where permed hair was the idealized version of how you present your hair. And so for their children who are now growing up in the US, who are welcoming and loving their Black identity and wanting to showcase that with their hair, this also becomes a point of tension between parents and children. And that the children may be more adventurous in trying to lock their hair or to wear their hair natural. And the way that they believe that now is an empowering experience, versus for their parents who may not necessarily agree with that, or still have some of those post-colonial views of what having locked hair or non-permed or natural hair may mean. So there are all those, intricate complexities and how people are also positioned and what that signals to others about status and class and position within society and community.
I have a question on labeling, probably.
Okay.
Because I've noticed, so you just said, right, like the second generation, they're very proud of their Black identity in the United States, but you described them as second generation Nigerian. Now, here in Germany, we have this ongoing conversation, or like oftentimes it's also voiced as critique, whereby people over generations are still identified as migrants, so like first, second, third, fourth generation migrant. And this migrantisation of people, even though they have a German passport, they were born here, they know little or nothing about the country where their parents come from. Others might know a lot because they visit regularly, but kind of like never coming out of this idea of like you're still the other to this imaginary German population. So how does that play out in the United States? Like, I mean, I always imagined this idea of like America as the melting pot, right? Like you arrive and kind of like, you're a bit stripped of your identity in some sense, and you become, like kind of like identified within the terms and the labels used in the United States.
Yeah.
So where does second generation Nigerian come into that?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because we're also having those conversations in the States of whether or not calling out second generation Nigerian is highlighting their difference or their lack of Americanness or their distinction from being American. And I think I use that term for two reasons. One is an analytical, theoretical reason, and that's because in migration studies, we tend to study immigrants longitudinally using generations as the axis of analysis.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense to then distinguish first generation as the generation that actually immigrated to the US, second generation being their US born kids. And part of the significance and reason and importance of that is that it allows us to think about intergenerational transfers. So in what ways are parents transmitting either income, class, status, language, culture, values to their second generation children. So having that analytical lens tends to be quite helpful for measuring and capturing the intergenerational dynamics and transmissions. And then the second reason is practical. So when I speak to participants and they talk about their identity and they identify, they talk about themselves as second generation. So they don't use the social science jargon, and they're not specifying like I'm second generation Nigerian, but they speak in terms of I'm American, I was born in the US, but my parents are Nigerian. So in essence, they're describing the definition of second generation, right? So by stipulating that I'm US born, however, my parents, and including that in their self-identification, it really is highlighting exactly what we try to measure with that term, second generation.
And do they identify as American or Nigerian?
So this is where the hyphenated identity comes into play. And honestly, one of my participants said it best when thinking of just how multifaceted this and complex and fluid this identity really is. So he'd said that when I'm speaking to a white individual or someone who's of a different race, I'm Black. I'm viewed as Black, and I usually relate and see myself as Black. When I'm speaking to another Black person who may be African American or have either African or Caribbean or West Indian ancestry, then I'm Nigerian. But when I'm speaking with a Nigerian, then I'm Igbo or Yoruba or another ethnic group, right? So there are all these nested identities within one person's encapsulated identity and personhood. And it shows up in different contexts, in different spaces, and different milieus based on who they're interacting with. And I'm sure some of your research too on Blackness in Germany also highlights how these identities can be fluid and complex.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, it also brings us back to this where we started, right? Like this idea of like the heterogeneity of Blackness and like these different layers, and depending on who you speak with, it becomes more and more complex in terms of like what you draw on. But no, definitely, I think, I mean, my research would be in migration studies terms, first generation, right? So they migrated to Germany, but there's definitely kind of like a lot of them identify in terms of where they come from. So I noticed like oftentimes at the beginning of the interview, they will introduce themselves as like, my name is, and I'm from. So it's kind of like it features still very strongly. And then we often talk about like, who are your friends? Like, who do you spend a lot of time with? And that's where those layers that you spoke about. So like ethnic identity, religious group, identification comes back and it's back at play and like kind of like determines who you want to associate with here in Germany. Well, this is all that we have time for today, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and to have this chat about hair and marriage and migration. And I think it's such a fascinating topic, so I hope you have another chance to talk. And I wish you all the very best for the next 3 months of your stay here as a scholar in residence. and I hope you enjoy your time.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation and look forward to further discourse on these issues.